set?
Thanks, Ian. How are you doing?
Gonna get these guys up here. All right, everybody.
Hi, my name is Zach Berdeo. God has kind of been putting it on my heart to share my story of what's been happening in my life over the past several years. So I've been sharing it at a couple different churches and at the Christian high school in Sheboygan. And I'll be sharing it again, my testimony here today and kind of my story and how God's been working in my life. So yeah, I'll get started and then hopefully we can kind of have a candid conversation amongst ourselves and a discussion afterwards. The topic of mental health is simply uncomfortable for most people. Some forms of suffering are very easy to talk about and support people through. If someone develops cancer or loses a loved one or is born with some sort of physical disability, it can be somewhat easy to visually understand what hardship that person is struggling with. Some struggles are out in the open, but some aren't. Sometimes suffering takes place in the brain or in the heart where no one can see it, and that can make talking about it a bit awkward. For men in particular, it just isn't in our nature to talk about our feelings, depression, or any form of mental health issue. So many of us were raised in an environment that has expected us to be stronger than our emotions, and this has produced a culture in which our masculinity stops us from acknowledging any form of emotional pain. Despite the facade of toughness that many men prefer to put on, depression and anxiety are a serious problem. According to the American Psychological Association, 9% of men have daily feelings of depression or anxiety, and over 30% of men will suffer from at least one major depressive episode at some point during their life. It is generally believed that depression and anxiety are more commonly problems for women, but many statistics indicate that men are suffering just as much as women. In fact, there are 4 times more instances of suicide in the male population than in the female population. Men are commonly put under a tremendous amount of stress in their lives and are expected to do so much more than they can handle, and this inevitably leads to depressive episodes. Yet men feel like they are weak if they admit to needing help. I'm here to share my testimony and open the door for a discussion about mental illness that I think so many of us can relate to. I have suffered from severe clinical depression and anxiety since I was in 8th grade. By the time I was in middle school, it became clear that I had some major self-esteem issues, and I have always had trouble finding positivity in myself. When I was 13, the world around me was changing rapidly, and I couldn't help but feel inferior to many of my classmates as the chemicals in my brain began to change and I entered adolescence. I had developed an immense fear of incompetence that I still carry with me today that has always told me that I hadn't done enough or that I couldn't do well enough. In the years prior to this, I was strongly drawn to pastoral ministry and devoted myself to reading scripture, prayer, and hoped to become a pastor one day. All of this fell apart when massive depressive episodes started to hit me shortly before my 14th birthday. It felt like God had abandoned me completely as I was thrown into a new stage of life and a high school experience where I felt like I was unattractive, a constant failure, and I couldn't stop comparing myself to the people around me that seemed to be superior in every way. I was being crushed by a mental illness, and I thought it made me weak. I did everything I could to prevent people from knowing about my condition because I didn't think anyone could understand. I didn't even understand. At this point, I certainly didn't stop believing in God, but it was hard for me to love Him considering that my entire life was starting to be dominated by depressive episodes that controlled my life and prevented me from doing just about anything. 2013 was composed of the second half of my sophomore year and the first half of my junior year, and it was the worst year of my life. I was so incapacitated by social anxiety and severe depression that I was only able to go to school 2 or 3 days per week. Life had become so dark and meaningless to me that I spent a large portion of that year laying in my bed and wishing I was dead. I couldn't find any value in myself, and God felt as if He did not and could not exist. The pain of that year is so great that I've actually repressed most of the memories from that time period and have little recollection of some of what happened. It is only by the grace of God that I was able to pass my classes and keep up with the schoolwork that was required of me. By Thanksgiving of 2013, I had missed an entire week of class and was severely depressed to the point where I was in danger of taking my own life. I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital where I spent several days. My condition improved after this hospitalization, but my faith and self-esteem were not where they should have been. I was able to function and attend classes, through the last 3 semesters of my high school experience, but I still experienced self-loathing and I put God on hold. I held an anger for God because I felt that my life and my high school experience had been destroyed by a mental illness that I had done nothing to do to deserve. I thought that everyone around me was thriving and happy and had goals and dreams while I was stuck and would have to suffer through a life of sadness while all my friends and classmates would fulfill their potential. I knew that I wanted to attend college after high school but had no idea what I wanted to do, so I went to UW-Sheboygan where I realized that I loved philosophy. My professor was a man who I describe as a very sarcastic, angry, and perverse atheist who went out of his way to point out what he perceived to be the philosophical flaws of Christianity. At this point in my life, I was still 18 years old and disconnected from my faith, as I think so many teenagers are. Since my mental health had improved, I had become comfortable maintaining a shallow relationship with the Lord that was more focused on my wants and desires rather than God's plans for me. All of that changed when I was exposed to what I was exposed to at college. The teachings of this philosophy professor, as well as the perspectives given by several other professors, presented me with convincing evidence that my God was a lie. Some would even say that if God truly loved me, then there was no way I could have been subjected to the suffering that I had to endure through high school. I felt like I had heard this story so many times before. Young adults who are struggling to make sense of the world go off to college and learn that much of what they had been taught by their parents and church was nonsense. But I couldn't accept what my professors told me. Deep down, I still love my God, and I always will, and I have felt him with me through every second of my life. Even in the agony of anxiety attacks and thoughts of suicide, I couldn't deny that my Creator was there. So instead of buying into secular philosophy, I fought it. The spiritual fire that I thought had burned out when I was in middle school was ironically brought back to life by a group of educators who have always denied the Lord. Before I even knew what apologetics was, I kind of turned into one of those God's Not Dead college kids and started doing my own thinking and research. Over the course of a few weeks, I thought up and wrote a paper titled Christian Philosophy for the College Student. It was in this document that I produced 3 main tenets that are made to counter many of the arguments that are passed around in secular circles of education. I gave this paper to my friend and youth pastor at First Reformed Church, Toby Tomac, and he was just about as excited about the topic as I was. He encouraged me to share the paper with the congregation, and I read it in front of the church in May of 2016. My love for the Lord had returned in a mysterious way, and I discovered that God had gifted me with a hunger to learn and write about my passion for his grace and love, as well as defending my faith through the study of apologetics. This is one of the first times that I recall thinking about how crazy and radical our God is, and it certainly wasn't the last. My rediscovered faith and interest in theology and philosophy led me to Trinity Christian College for my sophomore year. Here I experienced a wonderful Christian community and an educational experience that showed me how much I had to learn and still have to learn. I went through a tremendous year of growth and learned so much about myself, others, and the Lord through these experiences, and I am forever grateful. God was generous enough to give me the gift of joy as I found friendships among my fellow students and my brilliant professors. I was asked to apply for a resident assistant position at Trinity, and I was blessed enough to be chosen by the Residence Life staff to serve as an RA for my junior year. This experience taught me more lessons than I can count, although it was extremely painful and humbling. Being in a position of leadership among my peers matured me in extraordinary ways, but it brought out my insecurities and my mental health issues in ways that I hadn't predicted. I quickly adapted a deep care for all of the students on my floor. However, I soon learned why the position of RA is not something that is right for everyone, and why it is considered to be so stressful. As a person who is obligated to report all illegal or banned activities, few people wanted to associate with me or speak to me. I was in a tremendously awkward social situation with many people as they tried to hide their social lives from me because they were afraid I would report them. In addition to this, it became apparent that most 19-year-old boys aren't particularly fond of Bible studies and spiritual conversations like I was. Instead of accepting this fact, I made the mistake of taking credit for some of the lack of interest and spirituality among the young men on my floor. All of the pride that I had accumulated by being chosen as an RA was crushed, and I felt as if I was failing as a Christian, as a leader, and as a friend. This resulted in the fall 2017 semester being perhaps the most torturous 4 months of my life. I would spend countless hours each day laying in my bed, paralyzed with anxiety. If you were to ask me about the condition of the young men on my floor a little over a year ago, I would have told you that they hated me and I was despised by the general population of the college. Of course, I now see that this was completely untrue, but I was very mentally ill at the time and could not be convinced otherwise. For months, I would be hit with wave after wave of panic attacks as I imagined all of the ways that the people around me hated me, and I concluded that I must be worthy of this imaginary hatred, so I hated myself too. I loathed my very being. I experienced such massive depression that several times a week I would leave campus and walk along busy streets near the school because the thought of running into traffic and ending my life was the only thing that could give me any comfort. If not for the wonderful support from friends, family, faculty, the residence director at Trinity, and the intervention of God, I would not be alive today. By Thanksgiving break of 2017, I came home and had a suicidal breakdown and was admitted to a psychiatric hospital once again, exactly 4 years after the first hospitalization. I fell into an incredibly dark place during my time there, but quickly rebounded. I struggled to get back on my feet mentally in the coming weeks and was barely able to finish the semester from my home. Looking back on the situation, I clearly needed to step away from school and work on my mental health, but I wanted to finish my junior year successfully, so I went back to Trinity for the spring semester. I was only there for 3 days before I fell apart again and saw that I needed to not only step away from the RA position, but step away from school for the semester. I returned back to Oostburg, where God led me through a time of reflection and blessings. By February of 2018, I was overcome with the gift of happiness that I had gone so long without. God blessed me with confidence and a somewhat healthy self-esteem for the first time in my life. My relationship with the Lord improved, and I became so grateful for life and the people around me and the undeserved blessings that I am given each and every day. As horrible as mental illness is, it has made me so much more thankful and appreciative for the awesome God that we serve. God's grace has become so much more powerful and amplified because of the years of suffering that I've endured. As my confidence grew and my relationship with the Lord strengthened, I was given yet another blessing. I had the privilege to meet a local pastor named Dave Velthorst. I have never met a man who pursues God's heart and has a passion for spreading the gospel like he does. Over the past 8 months, God has worked through him to help my faith to grow in tremendous ways. All of these blessings came together, and I was ready for the next chapter in my life. As wonderful of a school as Trinity Christian College is, I decided that I needed a fresh start and planned on transferring to Grand Canyon University in Phoenix, Arizona. I started the semester there in August, and everything in my life changed. It felt as though all of the progress and growth that I had made throughout the year was reversed. Somehow, all of my confidence that I had found in Christ seemed to vanish, and my depression and anxiety returned in a severe manner. Within 2 weeks of being at the college, I was dangerously depressed and at risk of suicide. I knew I was unsafe and decided to get help through a student counseling service that was on campus. From there, I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital once again. I couldn't believe what my life had become. Nothing made sense. I thought God had brought me through my struggles with mental illness, and now I would be strong and confident and would lead a happy life. As strong as I thought my relationship with the Lord was, I was far too reliant on my own strength. I needed to be humbled, and this experience did just that. Ending up in the hospital in Phoenix showed me that relying on anything but Christ would result in failure in my life. While in that hospital, I was scared, defeated, and confused. Everyone in the hospital was either schizophrenic or a heroin addict, and many of them came from violent backgrounds. I didn't feel like I belonged there. Every day I made phone calls to my parents and to Mr. Velthorst. During my second day there, Mr. Velthorst said something that I'll never forget. He said, "Zach, there has never been a moment in your life when God wasn't sovereign." As soon as I hung up the phone, I went into my room in the hospital and started to cry because I was so touched by this truth. No matter how little this life makes sense to me, and no matter how unfair things can seem, God always has control. And in that moment, things changed for me, and I began to accept the situation. I turned back towards God and began to read my Bible and found healing in God's Word. To my astonishment, God turned my time in the Phoenix hospital into a mission trip. I was able to share the gospel with 3 different people during my time there, and I am still in contact with one of them. When I entered the hospital, I admittedly felt disgusted and scared of all of the heroin and meth addicts that surrounded me, but God quickly humbled me and showed me how to love these people just as Christ does. God called me to go to Phoenix, but not for the reason I thought he did. After 6 days, I left the hospital and enthusiastically hoped to finish the semester. I was disappointed to learn that the school would forcibly remove me from their campus due to my mental health issues. And so I packed up and drove back to Oostburg over the next few days. This leads me to where I am today. My mental health is still a constant struggle for me. To this day, my self-esteem and confidence are not where I wish they were. I still have days where I struggle to get out of bed because I can't find any silver lining in my life, and other days where I feel so anxious that I almost can't breathe. My mental illness probably isn't something that's going to go away overnight one day, and I've had to accept that. This is a fight that I may be in for the rest of my life. I'm not sharing my story here today to bring sympathy or attention to myself. I'm sharing this with you because I know so many of you are going through the same things I am, and I'm sure many of you have even had it far worse than I've had it. Mental illness is everywhere, and it has the power to cause so much pain among the people who suffer from it. I am sharing my story on behalf of everyone who struggles with it. It is okay for us to talk about it and support one another. The sooner we can become comfortable with our insecurities and anxieties and the damage we've experienced in this fallen world, the sooner we can piece together a remedy to this often silent epidemic that is tearing apart the lives of so many people. I stand here today because everyone goes through immense struggles in their life, whether it be mental illness or something else, and I'm called to tell you that Christ is our only comfort and hope in the midst of this pain. As a message to young people, many of you will move on to the next chapters in your lives in the coming years, and I must warn you that things may not go according to plan. High school was not how I imagined it would be, and college certainly hasn't turned out the way I wanted it to. But that is life. You have a powerful God who is sovereign and good and loves you beyond your imagination. He will accomplish great things through your life, even in the midst of your pain. One final encouragement I hope to leave all of you with is that Christ and the awesome message of the gospel is the only thing that gives us hope and allows us to make sense of the suffering and cruelty we experience. Regardless of who you are and what kind of struggles you will endure, it is vital that as Christians we remember that although we all endure so much pain that feels unnecessary and unjust, the Lord is not the creator of our suffering, and He does not take pleasure in your pain. Only the God of the Bible has the wisdom and the loving capacity to turn the awful hardships we endure into molding experiences that strengthen us and spread His wonderful and true message of hope achieved by Christ on the cross. Our misery points to God's grace rather than any notion of neglect. The suffering we carry with us through every moment of our lives is so heavy that it is truly unbearable if Christ hadn't carried that burden with us with the cross, hadn't carried that burden for us with the cross. The full meaning of the cross is so great that I wonder if it is really beyond human comprehension. What the resurrection of Christ means to the human condition is unfathomable. The collective decision that humanity made to betray the will of God and embrace our sinful nature is unforgivable. The seemingly unjust and horrible existence that is bestowed upon all of us is only overpowered and overtaken by the love displayed by God on the cross. When Jesus accepted the fate of betrayal and crucifixion, He took the burden of sin from a world that was doomed to corruption and evil. This is why the crucifixion and suffering of Christ was so necessary. Only something as heart-wrenching and perverse as the penalty made for a criminal being given to the perfect and blameless Son of Man could alleviate and correct the horrors of this world. Only the power of the cross can allow us to remain full of joy, hope, and love, even though we struggle with mental illness and so many other painful burdens. Suffering should not lead us to question the existence of God, but instead should remind us of the sacrifice God made through His Son and the unimaginable love and grace that He has shown for a human race that has proven over and over again that it does not deserve His love. Through the sacrifice made by Christ, evil has already been defeated, and all of the unspeakable suffering in this world is promised to be made right through the victory achieved by our all-powerful God. Perhaps my favorite passage in all of Scripture describes the hope that exists for all of us through Christ, even in the midst of our suffering. Revelation chapter 21, verses 4 through 6 says, He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then He said, Write these down, for these words are trustworthy and true. He said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost, from the spring of the water of life. And Romans 8, verse 18 says, For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. The joy we as Christians will experience in the next life is so much greater than the pain and discomfort of this life that they cannot even be compared. I think it is important for Christians to come to terms with the story of sin that begins in Genesis 3 and ends in Revelation. the powerful true story that is contained in the Bible and is witnessed in our daily lives, is unmistakably a story that involves an excessive amount of suffering, but this suffering is overruled and in control by a God, whose love is beyond our comprehension. God has not only defeated this sin through the sacrifice made by Christ on Calvary, but his sovereign control and power over this corrupted world means that our misery can and will be used for the glory of God's kingdom. Just as the Lord used the suffering I experienced from depression to spread the gospel to people in Arizona, the Lord works in radical and remarkable ways to achieve his plans through the unfortunate realities of this fallen world. Thank you. Yeah,
I just say thank you for your courage and your encouragement.
thank you.
It goes both ways.
Thank you. It's not easy to talk about, and it
No.
gets easier.
No, I wouldn't think so. No. That's why I say it takes a lot of courage to offer and reveal that. And yet, if we're all honest, we all have some issues this side of heaven. As I said tonight, we're not born with perfect minds, we're not born with perfect bodies, and we all have issues, though they may be different in different degrees, but and that's why I think if we're honest, we can empathize and relate to some extent, maybe not that particular issue or pain that you suffer in that way, but other pains and other sufferings, so we're all in that same community together. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Excellent communicator.
Did you find that when you finally admitted to your depression, it is a clinical disease, you know, and people would tell you just got to get over it. It's, you know, anxiety attacks and stuff like that.
Yeah. There's a mixture of responses. Some people, the people who have really had, I think, that mental illness and they've been through it, they get it. And they communicate with you, or if they've had a close loved one that's been through it. But for someone who's never really saw it, or never experienced it, it's almost impossible. I think it may be really impossible to understand, and I don't blame them. I mean, if you haven't seen a close family member, if you've never felt it, how can you understand it? So I think creating a culture, especially among men, because it's so hard for us to talk about it, creating a culture where we can just listen to one another, especially on an issue like this, I think it's really important.
How old were you when you were diagnosed?
I started, when I was 13, I was noticing really bad anxiety, and then when I was about 14, I would say, about the time I turned 14, towards the end of 8th grade, was when I started to get really, really depressed. And it is something that runs in my family, so I can definitely link it genetically. So I knew there was a risk of it happening, but it's bad.
Were you able to hide it from your family when you were having a real bad day?
I told my parents. My dad's here. They knew right away. I hid it from my friends. I wanted to hide it from my teachers, although they had to find out because I wasn't going to school so much. I wanted to hide it from everyone at church because it's something that I thought was a weakness, and I still feel that way some days. It makes me feel like I'm weaker than everyone else because when I'm feeling like that, I still have days once in a while where I can't go to work, and I look outside and everyone else is functioning, and how can I not feel weak? And so when I was in high school, I just felt like I was way weaker than everyone else, so I did everything I could to hide that from my fellow students, from teachers, from the church, but my parents knew.
I mean, I've been suffering from clinical depression and PTSD for like 25, 30 years already. And I found that from my wife and my kids, I could hide it even on my worst days. You had ways of... Another question I have is, did you ever try to put, like they say, all your ducks in a line? Like, my parents won't miss me once I'm gone because they got their own lives to lead and stuff like that.
When I'm that low, I can convince myself that I
Yeah.
won't be missed. Yeah, it's possible. So, yeah.
The worst part for me is when, I was in the hospital and I came out, and even though the law says that it is a disease and you can't be discriminated against for it, I was, I drove truck all my life, but dispatcher called me into his office as soon as he heard about it, and he says, your head problems are your head problems, leave them at home, don't bring them to the truck. You know,
Yeah, yeah, for the most part, I've been treated well. Worcester School District was wonderful to
Yeah.
me, all the teachers were fantastic. Trinity, it was the second college I was at, was fantastic. Grand Canyon was obviously not. When I came back from school, they just said, we want nothing to do with you. They wrote me this letter and said my behavior was completely unacceptable and banned me from the campus. I was essentially expelled.
really,
Yes.
yeah, you know,
So, I think it's getting better, the stigma of it, but there's still plenty of groups like that college that, they refuse to understand it, they don't wanna understand it, they want nothing to do with you. So, I'm hoping we can move past that in the coming years, cause I don't think that's okay.
that's about the same